The wind moaned through the cottonwoods like a thing grieving. Snow had come early, laid itself quiet and deep over the Wyoming plain, burying what was left of the garden, the path, the past summer's bones. On the ridge, a single black hawk cut circles in the gray sky. Down below, she stood in the doorway of a sagging house that was no longer warm. Her fingers were raw and chapped, her dress thin, her eyes swollen from crying, though she'd stopped making sound. There was no man's coat draped over the chair by the hearth, no voice from the barn. The world had hollowed itself out and left her standing in it like a fence post forgotten in the snow. She pulled the shawl tighter around her shoulders and stepped out, boots crunching over the drifted porch, her breath visible like a soul escaping. Inside, the baby was coughing again. Henry, the eldest, sat beside the crib, jaw clenched, pretending to read. He was 10, but had begun walking like a man too old for his years, carrying water-chopping wood with a quiet fury that reminded her too much of his father. She didn't say anything to him now. There wasn't anything left to say. The words had worn thin in the weeks since that fever took Emmett. Took him fast, without reason or fairness, and left her with 3 children, a mortgage, and ground too hard to bury a man in. The cows had wandered off. The barn roof sagged under snow she couldn't clear. And every day the sound of her own heartbeat in her ears grew louder, more frantic. The silence didn't comfort her anymore. It mocked. She reached the well and dropped the bucket. The rope rasped in her hands, stiff with ice. When she pulled it back up, it came too light. The bucket had cracked. She stared at it, then laughed, a dry, breathless sound that made the hawk wheel lower. She tossed the rope aside and leaned hard on the post, her head against the splintered wood. The ache in her chest spread like a fire looking for something to burn. Behind her, a horse nickered. She turned slow, not startled, just too empty to startle anymore. He sat astride a worn sorrel, tall in the saddle dust and snow in equal measure on his coat. His face was half in shadow from the wide brim of his hat, but she saw his eyes dark and steady, not cold exactly, just watchful. A man who'd learned to read trouble from far off and decide whether to ride past. He hadn't. He touched the brim of his hat. "Ma'am," She didn't speak, just stared, taking in the stitched tear along his sleeve, the rifle across his back, the calm weight of him in the saddle, like he'd been born there. "You're off the road," she said finally, her voice rasping like it had to break ice to get out. He nodded once. "I saw smoke. Thought maybe the place was still lived in. Not much of it is." He didn't smile, didn't dismount either. Just looked past her toward the window, with the crooked shutter, the small faces pressed to the glass, watching. "Need anything?" he asked, not unkind. She hesitated. Pride clawed at her throat, told her to say no, told her to close the door and weather the storm with what little she had left. Then the baby coughed again, thin and sharp, like it might break him in two. She closed her eyes. "Wood, if you can." He swung down without a word, moving with the slow, sure rhythm of someone who'd done hard things for a long time. She watched him walk to the stump, lift the axe like it weighed nothing. The crack of splitting wood echoed like gunfire across the frozen field. Her knees went a little soft and she sat on the porch rail. She didn't thank him. Not yet. Inside, the fire would burn warmer. The children would sleep easier. And she would watch a stranger work with his sleeves rolled to the elbows, his breath coming in steady clouds, as if the world had not fallen to pieces just last month. He was not a promise. He was not hope. He was just a man who had not ridden past. She did not ask his name that first night. When the wood was stacked and the sun had sunk like a dying coal behind the hills, he stood by his horse waiting for her to speak. She almost didn't. Pride was a tight thing like wire around her ribs. But then she looked at Henry asleep in the rocker with the baby curled against him, both too pale, too still. "There's a cot in the shed," she said, eyes on the floor. "It's not warm, but it's dry." He nodded. That'll do." She watched him walk the horse around, watched his shadow stretch and disappear in the snow, thick dark. Then she bolted the door and leaned against it, trembling from something she couldn't name. His presence didn't comfort her. Not yet. But it steadied the air somehow, made it less hollow. By morning he'd carried water from the creek and stacked a second pile of wood under the eaves. She found him boiling coffee over a pan of coals. The smell made her stomach clench. She hadn't eaten since the day before yesterday. He poured 2 cups, handed her one without looking at her directly. She took it, hands curling around the tin like it was the only warm thing in the world. "You passing through?" she asked. "I was, well—" A pause. Something changed. He shrugged. "Not yet." She studied him then. He had a lean face, wind-cut and quiet. A man not much older than Emmett had been, but worn in different ways. Not kindly, not gently, but not cruel either. Just like the land, scarred, enduring, still here. "I can pay," she said, "for the help." "No need. I wasn't offering charity. I wasn't asking for it." They stood in silence, steam rising from the cups between them, the wind sighing around the corners of the house like an old woman telling stories no one asked for. Inside, Henry was feeding the baby dry bread soaked in warm milk. Little Ruth was still curled under quilts in the corner, her thumb in her mouth, face blotchy from old tears. The sight of them hit her in the chest like a hammer. She swallowed hard. "What's your name?" she asked. "Call me Cole." She nodded once. "I'm Miriam." He didn't smile, just tipped his head in acknowledgement, like that was enough. They worked side by side that day, wordless for the most part. He hauled water, split more wood, fixed the hinge on the barn door that Emmett had meant to get to before he died. She cooked what little she had, a stew made from potatoes, the last of the carrots, and a bit of jerky she'd been saving. When she handed him a bowl, he took it like it was sacred. By dusk he had brought the stray cows in from the bluff where they'd wandered through the broken fence line. She watched him move among them, slow and steady, like he wasn't just herding cattle but calming them. Miriam stood in the doorway with the baby on her hip, the chill cutting into her ankles. The porch boards creaked under her weight. Her dress was still patched, her hands still cracked and raw. Nothing had changed. And yet, that night she heard him outside, whistling low and tuneless as he settled the horse, as if keeping company with something in himself. She pulled the quilt tighter around her shoulders and lay awake long after the children were asleep, staring at the ceiling. He hadn't said much, hadn't asked anything of her, but he was still there, and she didn't feel quite so invisible. Not yet safe, not yet saved, but seen. That was something. This road keeps going. Subscribe and follow it. By the third morning, Cole had fixed the smokehouse door and lined the chicken coop with burlap to keep the frost from killing the last of the hens. He moved through the yard with the patience of a man used to doing things alone and doing them right, like the world wouldn't forgive him if he didn't. Miriam watched him from the kitchen window as she kneaded bread with hands that no longer trembled. She didn't speak much to him, not more than necessary. But she noticed things. How he rolled his sleeves only halfway no matter the cold. How he never sat with his back to the door. How he spoke gently to the mare but rarely touched her. And how he never asked about Emmett. Most men would, out of curiosity if nothing else. But not Cole. He worked without needing to know what came before him. It was Ruth who asked first. "Is he a cowboy?" she whispered, tugging Miriam's sleeve after supper while Cole was outside scraping snow off the eave. Miriam didn't answer at once. She looked out the window, saw him in the fading blue light moving like a ghost between fence posts. "No," she said finally. "He's just passing through." But Ruth didn't believe her. Not really. And neither did Miriam, not anymore. That night Cole didn't return to the shed. He knocked once quiet, then stepped just inside the threshold. Miriam met him at the door, arms crossed, but not in anger. "The storm's coming down from the mountains," he said. "Winds are bad enough already. Shed won't hold. You want to sleep in here? I'll take the floor." She hesitated, not out of fear but caution. Her eyes flicked to the children, all three asleep by the hearth, safe, unaware. "All right," she said. "Blankets in the corner." He nodded once and laid himself down on the far side of the room between the stove and the wall. Didn't remove his boots. Didn't unbuckle the knife at his belt. He just pulled the blanket over his chest and turned his face to the wall. She watched him a long time in the flicker of firelight, and she felt something shift in her chest. Small, unspoken, like a window cracking open in spring. The days passed. He taught Henry to lash a sled from scrap wood, showed him how to trap rabbits along the edge of the property. When the creek froze, he carved holes and taught the boy how to fish through ice. He never raised his voice, but when he spoke, Henry listened. Miriam watched her son straighten under the weight of that attention. One night, while the wind howled through the chimney and sleet rattled the windows like pebbles, Cole sat at the table with a small wooden box. He carved something with the tip of a dull knife, slow and focused. "What's that?" Miriam asked, kneeling to stir the fire. "A horse," he said simply. "For Ruth." He nodded. "You carve much?" "Used to." Something in his voice folded in on itself like a shutter slammed shut. She didn't press. Later, when he stepped out to check on the livestock, she picked up the little figure. It wasn't finished, but it was beautiful in its own way. The lines of it were rough but honest. A small horse with its head slightly bowed, like it carried something heavy but meant to keep walking anyway. She ran her thumb over its back. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, she felt a strange warmth in her chest, one that had nothing to do with the fire. The cold held on longer than usual that year, the kind that seeps into the bones, settles in the joints, and makes you wonder if warmth was ever real. Miriam wrapped layers around the children, lit the stove before dawn, rationed flour like a gambler with only 2 coins left. She kept herself moving, always hauling, washing, mending, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking still hurt too much. Cole stayed. He didn't ask to, didn't declare it. Just rose each morning before the sun lit the fire, brought in water, fed the stock. Some days he rode out to check the road, see if it was passable. Other days he just worked. Quiet, capable, steady, as though he'd lived there all along. One evening after supper he handed Ruth the finished horse. She took it in both hands like it was gold. "Does she have a name?" she asked, eyes wide. Cole crouched beside her, shaking his head. "That's up to you." She looked at Miriam, then back at the carving. "I think her name's Mercy." Cole smiled, just a flicker of it. "That's a good name." Miriam felt something twist in her chest, tight and unexpected. Later, as she stood at the sink washing tin bowls with melted snow, she said without turning, "You've got away with them." He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "I like quiet. Children don't fill it the same way grown folks do." She gave a soft huff of a laugh. "You always this still, Cole?" "Not always," he said. "But I've found it keeps me upright." He didn't explain. She didn't ask. But that night she sat beside the fire long after the others had gone to bed, and when he passed her the last of the coffee, she didn't say thank you. She just drank it, warm and bitter, and felt it settle deep. The rhythm of the days became something close to peace. There were still hard hours, sickness didn't leave them be, and a fox took 2 hens, but the silence wasn't hollow anymore. It carried weight, meaning, company. One morning she found Cole standing at the edge of the field, staring out across the snow-crusted land with his hat in his hands. She approached without sound. He didn't move. "Something out there?" she asked. He shook his head. "Just thinking." "About what?" He glanced sideways. eyes softer than she'd seen them. "My father built a house once, put it on a rise like this. Thought the sun would come up right through the front window and start the day holy. Did it for a while." She looked out, imagining that house, that hopeful man. "What happened?" "Fire," he said. "Dry season." Sparks jumped the fence line. "And your family?" "Gone," he said simply. She turned toward him, wind tugging at her shawl. His face was still, but she saw it then, grief that hadn't left, just learned where to live. "I'm sorry," she said. He gave a small nod. "So was I." For a long time they stood there, the wind raw against their faces, silence thick between them. "I don't know how to start again," she said finally, almost to herself. "You don't?" he answered. "Not all at once. Just one thing, then another. You wake up, you make bread, you hold your child. It's not a beginning, but it keeps you from ending." Miriam looked at him, eyes stinging. "And after that, you look up one day," he said, voice low, "and you're still here." She wanted to believe him, so she stood beside him a while longer, shoulder to shoulder, eyes on the horizon. The snow had started melting at the edges of the fields, and under it the ground waited dark and alive. The thaw came slow, reluctant, as if winter feared being forgotten. Patches of earth emerged like old wounds across the field, muddy, uneven, but real. The sky turned less cruel, pale blue, creeping in behind months of gray. Birds returned cautious at first, their songs tentative. And with each day Miriam moved with a little less dread in her chest. Cole fixed the fence. Not just patched it, rebuilt the whole south line. He didn't ask for help, but Henry followed him like a shadow, learning without being told he was learning. They worked in near silence, broken only by the tap of hammer or the scrape of metal. Miriam watched them from the porch, a wash basket on her hip, something like wonder resting under her ribs. One afternoon she found Cole in the barn, sanding down old planks he'd salvaged from the hayloft. "What's this for?" she asked, brushing sawdust from her sleeve. He didn't look up. "Thought I'd build a table. The one inside's got legs like drunks." She smiled. "We've made do with worse." "I know," he said. "That's why I'm building it." That night he stayed later at the fire. The children were asleep, the house warm, the wind outside soft as breath. Miriam poured 2 cups, sat across from him. Her hands were rough, raw around the knuckles, but they didn't shake anymore. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked, not quite looking at him. He studied the fire a moment. "I used to think I had to. And now I don't know what I'm riding toward, or if I'm still riding at all." The room felt smaller then, closer. She could hear the tick of the stove cooling, the slow breathing of her children. She looked at Cole and saw not just a man who stayed, but a man who might be staying for her. She didn't speak, didn't move, but something passed between them, a quiet understanding. No promises, just the truth laid bare, like the land outside their door. A few days later, trouble arrived. The man came on a chestnut gelding, slick with road dust. His boots were polished, coat clean, and his mouth full of questions no neighbor should ask. Miriam stood in the yard, Ruth clinging to her skirts, while Henry stood stiff beside her. "I'm here on behalf of the bank," the man said, voice smooth. "The payments haven't come. You understand what that means, Mrs. Rourke?" She said nothing. Her throat was tight, hands clenched so hard the skin burned. The man turned to look at the house. "Shame. Could fetch a good price. You'll need to clear out by the end of the month." Cole came out from the barn, then slow and easy, wiping his hands on a rag. The man's eyes narrowed. "You staying here?" he asked Cole. "For now," Cole replied. "Well, then you'd do right to tell her what's coming. I reckon she already knows." The man sniffed, adjusted his gloves, and turned his horse. They watched him ride off in silence. Miriam didn't move. Couldn't. Cole stepped beside her, voice low. How far behind? 3 months, she said. Soon to be 4. He nodded, jaw tight. I'll ride to town in the morning. What for? Work. You don't owe us that. I know, he said. That's why I'm doing it. That night Miriam lay awake, staring at the rafters, her hand resting on the empty side of the bed. Not because she wished he were there, but because somehow it no longer felt right that he wasn't. Cole left at first light. Miriam stood in the doorway and watched his back disappear into the trees, the sun casting long shadows on the thawing ground. He didn't turn around. Didn't need to. He'd said what mattered the night before. I'll be back in a week. Maybe more. Depends on the work. And then softer, like a question he wasn't brave enough to ask, will you be here? She hadn't answered right away. Just met his eyes and held them. That was enough. Now the wind picked up, tossing her hair across her cheek. The road was empty again. She stepped inside, shut the door, and braced herself against the weight of waiting. The days passed slow. Without Cole, the place felt quiet in a way she didn't like. She kept her hands busy, patching clothes, hauling water, setting traps Henry had reset. But at night, when the fire burned low and the children were asleep, she found herself listening. For hooves. For his whistle. For any sign of him. 3 days turned to 5. Then 6. By the 8th day, she started to think he wasn't coming back. She told herself it didn't matter. Men left. They always did, one way or another. Through sickness, war, pride. Some left with words, others just faded. She'd survived it before. She could again. On the 9th day, the marshal rode up. He was a squat man with a thick beard and eyes that looked like they'd seen too much and cared too little. He tipped his hat as he dismounted. Ms. Rourke. She nodded from the porch, arms crossed tight. You know a man name of Cole Traverse? The name struck her like cold water. He's been working down at the rail line, the marshal went on. Good hand, quiet. Stayed out of trouble. She waited. The way the man said it, it wasn't just a neighborly visit. The marshal scratched his chin. Last night there was a fight in the saloon. Cards went bad. Words were said. One of the rail bosses got a bottle to the skull. Cole stepped in. Man drew on him. Her stomach dropped. He all right? The marshal nodded slowly. Wounded. Took a round in the side. Doc says he'll pull through. She didn't breathe. He kept asking someone send word. Said the woman'd worry. Gave your name. She gripped the porch rail. Where is he? Stationed up in Dry Creek. It's half a day's ride. You got someone could watch the young uns? She looked through the window at Ruth asleep on the floor, Henry rubbing ash on his hands at the hearth. The baby cooed soft in the cradle. I'll find a way, she said. The marshal nodded. I'll wait. Thought you might. They left within the hour, bundled in thick coats. Miriam rode behind the marshal, eyes forward, heart pounding harder with every mile. The road blurred past frosted trees, old stumps, pale hills rising like old bones. By the time they reached Dry Creek, the sun had started to sink. The town was nothing but a few crooked buildings and a smell of smoke in the air. The doctor's cabin sat at the edge of it all, a single lantern glowing in the front window. She stepped inside. Cole lay on a narrow cot, pale but alive. His shirt was bloodied at the side, his eyes rimmed with pain. But when he saw her, he tried to sit up. She moved to him, fast pressing a hand to his chest. Don't be stupid. He let out a breath. Didn't think you'd come. I told you before, she said, voice thick. You're not the only one who knows how to stay. He closed his eyes then. Just for a second, like the pain lifted. I got the money, he said quietly. Enough for the bank. Might have to work a bit longer, but she took his hand in both of hers. We'll figure it out together. He opened his eyes. We. She nodded. He didn't smile. Not really. But his eyes softened. I left the carving knife in the barn, he said. She laughed once raw and sudden. I'll keep it safe. Outside the night pressed in quiet and deep. But inside, for the first time in months, she felt warmth that had nothing to do with fire. Cole healed slow. He wasn't a man to complain, but pain made his silences heavier, and Miriam could see it in the way his jaw clenched when he moved wrong or tried too hard to sit up. She stayed by him at the cabin in Dry Creek for 4 days, sleeping in a rocking chair with a blanket over her knees, feeding him broth. She traded sewing work for mending shirts by the fire, while he drifted in and out of sleep. On the 5th morning he looked at her clear-eyed. I can ride, he said. You can barely walk. I'm not leaving you out there alone any longer. She looked at him for a long time, then nodded. Then we go slow. They rode out after noon. She helped him mount, tied his pack to the saddle, kept close in case he faltered. He didn't. Not once. But by the time they reached home, sweat had soaked through his coat, and she saw how he leaned just a little too heavy against the porch rail when they stopped. Henry ran out, first eyes wide, half man, half boy, grabbing the horse's reins like he'd been waiting his whole life to be useful. Ruth followed, shrieking with joy. You came back. Cole gave her a small smile, wincing. Told you I would. The house welcomed them with the smell of warm bread and firewood. Not much, but enough. Later, once the children were asleep, Miriam helped him lower himself to the edge of her bed. You'll stay here, she said. Not a question. He didn't argue. I never wanted to be someone a man had to save, she said quietly, smoothing the blanket over his legs. You weren't, he said. You kept this place alive. You saved yourself. She met his eyes. Then why are you still here? He hesitated, then reached into his coat pocket, pulled something small from it. It was a ring, simple, thin, no stone. Carved wood, polished, dark, worn smooth by time. I made it, he said. Long time ago. Never gave it to anyone. Miriam's throat tightened. Why not? Didn't stay in one place long enough. Never meant to. Never trusted what I'd find. She took the ring in her palm. It was warm, lighter than she expected. I'm not asking for promises, he said. Not yet. But if you wanted this to mean something, it could. Miriam sat beside him. The lamp flickered, throwing soft shadows against the wall. Her fingers curled around the ring. Do you know what it is to lose everything, she asked. Yes, he said. To rebuild, not knowing if it'll all fall again. He nodded. She looked down at the ring, then at him. Then I think you already know what kind of love I have left to give. He didn't speak, just took her hand in his, gentle and sure. They sat like that for a long time, the night stretching wide and open around them. Outside the wind shifted. The snow had stopped. Somewhere in the dark a coyote called, and another answered, soft, distant, alive. Spring was coming. The trail remembers those who stay. Subscribe now.